Tonight's story takes us into the quiet corners of Roman life. Not the grand speeches or epic wars, but the awkward dates, public flirtations, and politically arranged marriages that made up love and lust in the empire. Prepared to be amused, and maybe a little disturbed. You might think you're about to witness something steamy, but ancient Roman dating was often anything but. I'm the candlelight historian, and this is history as it was lived. Unforgiving, unfiltered, and brutally real. Comment your location and the time where you are. It's always fascinating to see how far and wide this little global community reaches. Now, relax, take a deep breath, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on a side street, just off the Roman Forum. It's evening. The air is heavy with dust and the faint scent of oil lamps and baked bread. Voices echo from every direction, arguments in Latin, laughter from nearby, the shuffle of sandals against stone. The buildings rise up in tiers, practical and severe. Laundry flaps from upper balconies. And somewhere, behind one of those shuttered windows, a young woman might be reading a love poem, not because she expects to marry for love, but because she knows she won't. In ancient Rome, romance, as we think of it, was not part of the daily vocabulary. It existed, yes, but not where you'd expect it. Not in marriage contracts, or dowry negotiations, or the dry legal rituals of betrothal. It lived, instead, in the margins, in whispered verses, in stolen looks, in jokes carved into tavern walls. Marriage in Rome was a civic duty, a legal arrangement, a way of producing legitimate heirs and preserving the family name, especially among the upper classes. A wedding wasn't so much the start of a love story as the start of a strategic partnership between households, a union of two last names. The Roman word matrimonium, after all, literally implies the function of producing mothers. But let's slow down and take a closer look at the people walking past you. There goes a senator, his toga pristine, his chin raised, flanked by clients hoping for a favor. He's likely in his 40s or older, and if he's married, and most of them were, the wife was probably chosen for him by his father, years ago, to cement some alliance. If he's affectionate toward her, that's considered a bonus. If not, nobody's particularly bothered. Behind him, a young woman in a simple stola walks quickly, eyes down. She's accompanied by an older woman, maybe a slave or maybe her mother. She might be on her way to a betrothal meeting, or maybe she's already married. Roman girls often were by the age of 14. And off to the side, you hear the tail end of a joke shouted from a tavern doorway. Something crude about a love affair gone wrong. Romans, much like us, loved gossip. They loved stories of romantic misadventure. They just didn't build their society around romantic success. For the average Roman, falling in love before marriage was not encouraged. Not just because it could be inconvenient, but because it was seen as foolish. Emotional attachment was seen as something private, almost shameful if expressed too publicly. You didn't marry the person you desired. You married the person who made political or economic sense. Love might come later, or not, and yet, Romans were not without feeling. They wrote love poetry. They whispered flirtations. They scratched out hearts on the walls of bathhouses. They made jokes about cheating husbands and overbearing wives. They just separated love from duty. Passion was not the foundation of marriage. It was its unruly cousin, best kept out of sight or managed discreetly. Take, for example, the poet Catullus. He wrote with raw emotion about a woman he called Lesbia, a pseudonym, of course. His verses swing between adoration, bitterness, and something close to obsession. Let us live and let us love, he writes, and let the judgment of the old be worth a single penny. It sounds romantic, but in context, it's a cry against social constraints. He knew full well that society would never condone him marrying a woman like Lesbia. The line between public life and private desire in Rome was thickly drawn. Men could indulge their appetites, within reason, with slaves, with mistresses, with actresses and dancers, and for women, not so much. The double standard was sharp, and we'll explore that in more detail later. But for now, just know that love, true aching, inconvenient love, was rarely rewarded. Still, Romans found their ways. Letters were passed under doors, rings exchanged in secret. There were stories of wives who genuinely adored their husbands, though those stories were sometimes held up more as moral lessons than real accounts. And for those without power or position, the bakers, the blacksmiths, the street vendors, love could bloom more freely, though always under the shadow of economic survival. Marriage, even then, wasn't about finding a soulmate. It was about creating stability, a partner to help you run the shop, raise the children, maybe fend off nosy neighbors. One of the most revealing sources we have about Roman romantic ideals is graffiti. The walls of Pompeii are covered in declarations of love, crude insults, and poetic ramblings. "I love the girl who lives across the street," one says. Another reads, "If only my mistress knew how much I suffer." Others are more to the point. Secundus says hello to his prima. That one, for all we know, might have been the Roman version of "Are you up?" So, did Romans fall in love? Absolutely. Did it look anything like our modern idea of dating? Not at all. Imagine for a moment that you're there, not as a tourist, not as a senator's guest, but as a local. Maybe you've just turned 16. Your father has already arranged your match. You've never met the person, but their family is respectable, their wealth acceptable, and that's enough. You might hope for affection, but no one asks what you want. Love, if it comes, will come later. Or perhaps it will come in secret, outside of the marriage, whispered in alleys, or inked into papyrus, and hidden under floor tiles. The romantic heart beats on, of course, but in Rome it beats quietly, carefully, just beneath the marble surface. Now that we've wandered through the dim streets and ducked past the fluttering curtains of Roman private life, it's time to shine a little lamplight on what marriage really meant in ancient Rome. And spoiler, it had very little to do with passion, poetry, or personal choice. Roman marriage was, at its core, a legal agreement, a highly strategic one. The kind of arrangement where you could almost imagine two fathers shaking hands over a wax tablet while the bride stood quietly off to the side, possibly wondering if she'd get a new pair of sandals out of the deal. For the elite, every marriage was an alliance, not a metaphorical one, a literal merging of families, fortunes, and political futures. A senator didn't marry because he was smitten by a girl's laugh or admired her eyes. He married her because her father controlled 10 vineyards and 3 votes in the Senate. She was a package deal. If she was pretty, well, that was nice. But far from essential. Roman law offered a few different types of marriage. And as with most Roman things, it was complicated enough to make a notary weep. The most traditional form, at least in the early Republic, was confarreatio. This was the old-fashioned, deeply religious form of marriage, reserved for patricians, the aristocratic class. It involved sharing a sacred cake made from emo wheat, offered to Jupiter himself. Yes, a divine wedding cake. This form also required 10 witnesses, a high priest, and a fair bit of ceremony. It was exclusive, and it was binding. Divorce was technically possible, but not exactly easy. Only the elite needed worry about this version, and even they moved away from it over time. Then there was coemptio, a slightly less theatrical affair. It was basically a symbolic sale. The bride was bought by the groom in a formal ceremony. The language used made it very clear. This was a transaction. The man acquired the woman. The woman entered his manus, or hand, meaning she legally became part of his family and his property. Don't worry, we'll explore that concept more later, because Roman ideas of ownership were layered. The third type, and eventually the most common, was called usius, or marriage by habit. Essentially, if a couple lived together for a year without the woman being away for more than 3 nights, they were considered married. Think of it as a slow-burn common law relationship with legal implications. In this case, the woman didn't fall under her husband's control, manus, and remained legally tied to her father's family. This had tax and inheritance advantages, and was especially popular among the upwardly mobile classes. Now, all of this sounds awfully bureaucratic, doesn't it? That's because it was. Roman marriage was filed, stamped, and notarized in all the ways love stories are not. Dowries were a major feature of all these arrangements. A bride didn't just bring herself, she brought a bundle of cash, property, jewelry, or land, gifted by her father. This dowry was designed to help support the couple and, in theory, protect the woman if the marriage ended. It also gave the husband a financial incentive not to toss her out too quickly. If he divorced her unfairly, he might have to return the entire dowry. And no one wants to lose the family goat farm over a petty argument. Marriages were usually arranged when girls were in their early teens, sometimes as young as 12, though the wedding often didn't happen until a little later. Boys, on the other hand, married later, in their mid to late 20s, once they had some kind of standing, property, or at least a respectable toga. You might be wondering, did the bride get a say? Occasionally, especially if her family was relatively liberal or less politically obsessed. But the general expectation was that a daughter's marriage was her father's decision. After all, the family's reputation, legacy, and estate were at stake. Letting a teenager choose her own husband, that would have sounded as absurd to them as letting a dog vote. Even emperors got in on the matchmaking madness. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, was particularly invested in promoting marriage, so much so that he passed laws encouraging it. He offered tax breaks to married couples with children and imposed penalties on those who remained single for too long. Not exactly the backdrop for candlelit romance. But to be fair, not every marriage was cold and calculated. Some couples did come to care for one another. Some arranged matches blossomed into quiet affection. But love was considered the icing, not the cake. And no Roman ever trusted icing to last through war, famine, or family lawsuits. Wedding ceremonies, when they happened, were formal but not overly grand, unless the families involved had money to spare and neighbors to impress. The bride would wear a flame-colored veil, symbolic of purity, though the fiery look made her resemble a walking sunset. She was led to her husband's house by torchlight, accompanied by a crowd of friends and relatives who sang suggestive songs, and shouted well wishes and occasionally rude jokes. Ancient Romans didn't believe in subtle transitions. At the threshold of the new home, the groom would lift his bride, or sometimes carry her across the threshold, a gesture later borrowed by modern Western weddings. But don't be fooled into thinking it was all sweetness. According to some traditions, she wasn't supposed to trip, speak too loudly, or appear too eager. Even her silence was scripted. And then came the marriage itself, which, for all the rituals and legalities, meant one main thing in Roman eyes: reproduction. The birth of legitimate children was the entire point. If you didn't have children, that was a problem. Not emotionally, but legally. Of course, not everyone had a grand wedding. The poorer classes, who didn't have much property or political clout, often didn't bother with formal arrangements. Two people living together and calling themselves married was good enough for most. Their unions were more flexible, less ceremonial, and often more human. But no matter the class, the institution of marriage in Rome was built to serve the state, not the heart. Which leads us to a peculiar contradiction. The Romans had an empire, aqueducts, road systems, concrete, and a standing army that terrified half the known world. But when it came to matters of love and marriage, they were more transactional than tender. You might imagine that this led to a lot of secret yearning, hidden liaisons, and clever poetry. And you'd be right. Let's follow the trail into the courtyard of a Roman domus, the kind of well-kept home that might belong to a prosperous senator or merchant. The marble floor is cool underfoot, the columns perfectly proportioned, and the atrium is open to the sky. Rainwater collects gently in the central basin. You might hear the quiet clink of jewelry or the distant thrum of domestic life. Here, moving through the shadows and sunshine, in her stola and veil, is the matrona, the Roman wife. To the modern eye, she looks serene, even regal. But her daily life was anything but leisurely. Behind the calm exterior is a life defined by duty, status, and 1,000 invisible expectations. From the moment a Roman woman married, her identity changed, often quite literally. She might leave her father's house and pass into the control manus of her husband, becoming legally part of his family. Or, if the marriage was sin manu, without that formal handover, she remained under her father's authority, even while living with her husband. This meant that legally, her property and inheritance rights stayed tied to her birth family. For women with powerful fathers, this was a useful loophole. For others, it was simply a complication. Regardless of legal structure, a wife's role was clear. She was to run the household, and not in the quaint, decorative way we might picture from romanticized period dramas. The Roman matron was more like the chief officer of a small domestic empire. She oversaw slaves, arranged meals, managed inventories, supervised weaving and garment production, and kept an eye on the family's financial affairs, at least the ones not controlled outright by her husband. This wasn't a role filled with romantic dinners or artistic hobbies. It was full of logistics. If there was a dispute among the household slaves, she dealt with it. If the household accounts didn't add up, she had to find out why. If a shipment of olive oil arrived late, she likely had someone sent to the docks to investigate. The matron kept the domus humming. And yet, for all this responsibility, she had no official power. Roman women couldn't vote. They couldn't hold office. They weren't considered full citizens in the way men were. Their influence had to be soft, indirect, and carefully maintained. A matron who was too outspoken risked being seen as immodest or unfeminine. One who was too quiet risked being overlooked altogether. It was a delicate line to walk, especially under the constant scrutiny of Rome's judgmental upper crust. Still, the matron held a symbolic position of real importance. She was expected to embody pudictia, modesty, chastity, loyalty. Roman writers praised women who stayed out of the spotlight, bore many children, managed their households flawlessly, and mourned their husbands with appropriate tears and hairstyles. In fact, statues of ideal Roman women often didn't celebrate beauty, but virtue, draped robes, calm expressions, eyes modestly downcast. The funeral of a respected matron was a public event. Eulogies praised her as a faithful wife, a loving mother, a skilled housekeeper. There were rarely mentions of personality. Witty, adventurous, charming, these weren't seen as selling points. A woman's worth was measured by how well she served others, her family, her husband, her children. But let's not mistake expectation for reality. Not all Roman women conformed to these ideals. Some bent the rules, pushed the boundaries. The historical record, written mostly by men, doesn't always capture the full truth. But we catch glimpses. Take Cornelia, the mother of the Gracchi brothers. Widowed young, she refused to remarry and devoted herself to educating her sons, both of whom became famous reformers. She was praised for her virtue, but she was also intelligent, politically astute, and likely much more influential than the eulogies let on. Then there's Livia Drusilla, wife of Emperor Augustus. Outwardly, she played the role of devoted matron, but behind the scenes, she was a master of palace politics, maneuvering her son Tiberius into the imperial succession and possibly having a hand in a few convenient deaths along the way. Always, of course, with perfect dignity, even in more modest homes. A wife might be her husband's most trusted partner, running the family business while he served in the military or worked in government. In inscriptions, some women are described as negotiatrix, businesswomen, managing shops, markets, or estates. These women weren't anomalies. They were part of the fabric of Roman life. Still, for most women, the public world remained distant. The street belonged to men. The forum was where men debated, argued, and schemed. The household, enclosed, private, quietly powerful, was the woman's sphere. And when it came to romance, a Roman matron wasn't expected to pursue it. In fact, she was expected to avoid it, at least publicly. Romantic feelings were to be directed only toward her husband, and even then, not too openly. Passion was considered suspect. A woman in love was a woman out of control, which makes the few stories of marital affection stand out all the more. Pliny the Younger, a Roman author and administrator, writes letters about his wife Calpurnia that are oddly touching. He praises her intelligence, her modesty, her singing voice. He says she listens from behind a curtain while he reads aloud. Whether it was true devotion or just good PR, it paints a picture of warmth. But those kinds of accounts are rare. Far more common are tales of cold alliances, political marriages, and women who were married off, moved around, and replaced as needed. Divorce was easy, for men at least. We'll get to that later. For now, know that a woman's role in marriage was precarious. She could be praised one moment, abandoned the next. Her virtue was her armor, and her household her battlefield. You might wonder, standing there in the courtyard with its sun-dappled pool and rustling laurel leaves, did she feel lonely? Did she hope for more? Maybe. But she likely never said it out loud. Instead, she would have overseen the dinner arrangements, instructed the slaves, adjusted her veil, and made sure her children were properly dressed to greet their father when he returned from the forum. No love letters, no bouquets, just duty, dignity, and perhaps, occasionally, a quiet moment alone at the window, watching the stars rise over Rome, wondering what life might have been like in another world. Let's turn the corner and walk into the world of Roman men, not the gladiators or generals this time, but the bachelors, the upstanding, toga-clad citizens with promising careers, respectable incomes, and absolutely no interest in candlelit dates. In ancient Rome, an eligible bachelor wasn't measured by charm or poetic flair. He was judged by land ownership, family reputation, and whether or not he'd made the proper sacrifices to the household gods. A square jaw or a nice laugh might be mentioned, but they weren't going to sway a marriage contract. Roman society expected men to marry. It wasn't just personal, it was civic, especially for men of rank. A man couldn't really hold high office without a proper Roman wife to his name. A wife gave a man social credibility. Children secured his legacy. Everything pointed toward marriage, eventually. But that didn't mean they were in any rush. Roman men, particularly from the senatorial or equestrian classes, typically married in their late 20s or early 30s. Before that, they had other things on their minds: studies, military service, political ambitions, and, for many, a comfortable indulgence in bachelor freedoms. And those freedoms came with wide latitude. The city was filled with options. Tavern girls, actresses, courtesans, and slaves, all accessible, all considered fair game for a man's desire. No one expected a young Roman man to be chaste. In fact, restraint was more likely to be mocked than admired. Self-discipline was fine in politics or war, but in love, a little mischief was considered healthy. There were, of course, unspoken boundaries. A respectable man might indulge, but he wasn't supposed to lose control. Falling in love with a low-born woman, especially one beneath his status, was considered naive. Worse, marrying her, that could be scandalous. Take the example of Clodius Pulcher, a Roman nobleman known for his reckless behavior. He once snuck into the women-only religious festival of Bernardii, dressed in a veil, supposedly trying to woo the wife of Julius Caesar. He was caught, tried for sacrilege, and although acquitted, his reputation never recovered. Clodius might not have been the ideal bachelor, but he was the warning story many young men heard. For the average Roman bachelor, love was expected to be entertaining, but not consuming. A man who pined too obviously was suspect. One who neglected his duties for a romantic dalliance, untrustworthy. The ideal Roman man was composed, clever, and firmly in control of his emotions. This ideal extended even into the bedroom. Roman writers often portrayed passionate love as something that happened to others, foreigners, women, or the overly dramatic. Real Roman men were supposed to have lovers, not be lovers. That's not to say they didn't feel things, but public displays of affection were frowned upon. A man who wrote love poetry was seen as peculiar. Unless, of course, he was already a famous poet, then he could get away with a lot. Men like Ovid walked that line. Ovid's Ars Amatoria, or The Art of Love, was a tongue-in-cheek guide to seduction. He advised Roman men on everything from where to meet women, the races, the theatre, anywhere with a crowd, to how to win their favor. It was clever, cheeky, and wildly popular until it wasn't. The Emperor Augustus eventually exiled Ovid, in part for corrupting Roman morals. Apparently, writing a pickup guide in poetic verse wasn't what the state had in mind for responsible bachelors. But most Roman men weren't writing poetry. They were running estates, campaigning in the army, or attending the long, boring meetings that passed for politics. Their romantic lives, when not tightly scheduled, were often left to the margins, to chance, to convenience, to whatever arrangement could be made without ruffling too many family feathers. And what about love? True love. Occasionally, you'll hear of a man who married for affection, or who spoke of his wife with genuine fondness. But these were rare, and often remarked upon because they were rare. A bachelor might keep a concubine, a long-term partner without the legal status of a wife. These relationships varied widely. Some were affectionate, some were transactional, some were both. And while concubinage was accepted, it was always seen as secondary to proper marriage. You could keep a concubine, but you needed a wife, preferably one from a good family, with a generous dowry and excellent childbearing hips. For the ambitious bachelor, then, love was something to be controlled, channeled, or simply avoided. It wasn't that feelings didn't exist, they did, but acting on them was something else. It risked scandal. It risked gossip. And in the delicate world of Roman reputation, gossip was often as dangerous as poison. Of course, not all bachelors were model citizens. Some drank too much, gambled too much, or had scandalous affairs. But even the worst of them usually found wives, because marriage wasn't about behavior, it was about legacy. A wild bachelor could still be a good political pawn, so long as he had a name, a fortune, or a famous uncle. Someone was always willing to marry their daughter off to him, and that's the strange contradiction. The Roman bachelor might indulge in every kind of romantic misadventure. He might flirt, cheat, seduce, and disappear for days. But when the time came to marry, he was expected to straighten his toga, nod politely, and enter into a contract with a woman he might barely know. No vows of eternal devotion, no grand declarations, just a firm handshake, a list of assets, and a schedule for the wedding feast. If you're imagining a line of Roman grooms, slightly hungover, muttering legal formulas under their breath while their new brides stood silently beside them, you wouldn't be far off. Let's step past the marble pillars and out of the bright light of Roman respectability. We're entering quieter spaces now. Bedrooms, servants' quarters, private villas tucked away in the hills. Because while Roman marriages were all about duty and legacy, personal desire found its own way, and it often found it outside the marriage bed. A Roman man of means, especially one with a household of slaves, had opportunities for physical companionship that were never discussed in public but widely accepted in practice. It wasn't seen as scandalous. It wasn't even particularly secret. In fact, it was expected. Start with the slaves. Enslaved people in Rome had no legal rights, including the right to consent. If you were an enslaved woman or man, your body was considered the property of your master. There were rules on paper about the treatment of slaves, but few were enforced. If a wealthy Roman desired one of his slaves, he didn't need to ask permission. He simply acted. These relationships varied. Some were casual, some were long-standing, and some, particularly when the same slave was favored over time, took on the appearance of a domestic partnership. But the power dynamic was always there. Even if the master treated a favored slave kindly, that person could be sold, punished, or ignored at any moment. Sometimes, a slave mistress would bear children. These children were considered slaves too, unless the master chose to free them. Occasionally, these relationships became semi-official. A freedwoman who had once been her master's concubine might continue living with him. She might even run his household, but she would never be a legal wife. Then there were courtesans and professional mistresses. These women, often highly educated and trained in music, conversation, and flirtation, served the elite in ways that respectable matrons could not. They moved in artistic circles, performed at banquets, and were known by name in the gossip of the day. The most famous of them were not poor. Some were wealthy in their own right. They received gifts, property, even political favors. They knew how to charm a senator, tease a poet, and host a dinner that would be talked about for weeks. But they also walked a fine line. They could be celebrated one moment, discarded the next. Mistresses had no legal standing. If a man grew tired of his mistress, he simply moved on. If he tried to make her more permanent, eyebrows would rise. It was one thing to indulge in private, another to disrupt the social order. Marrying a former mistress, especially one from a lower class, could damage a man's reputation. Love was not considered a good reason to append tradition. Still, That didn't stop some men from trying. There were cases of powerful men who freed their slave mistresses and married them. The Emperor Claudius famously married Messalina, who came from a respectable family but was accused of scandalous behavior and multiple affairs. Roman historians, most of them senatorial men with strong opinions, were brutal in their descriptions of her. Whether they exaggerated or not, Messalina became the cautionary tale, the dangerous woman who broke the rules. Even more scandalous were relationships between Roman women and their own slaves. This was deeply taboo. A man could sleep with his female slave and face no consequences. But a woman who did the same with her male slave risked disgrace, exile, or worse. She might be accused of madness. Her family could disown her. The double standard was written into the very fabric of Roman life. Affairs, of course, weren't limited to slaves or courtesans. Aristocrats often had relationships with each other, though these were more complicated. A married man who seduced another man's wife risked serious consequences. Not legal ones, necessarily, but social. A public scandal could ruin a career, lead to duels, or even provoke violent retaliation. On the other hand, a married man's affair with a widow or unmarried woman was considered less offensive. Though still not ideal, discretion was key. Affairs were tolerated if they were quiet. The moment they became public, everyone pretended to be shocked. And yet, the culture was full of desire. Roman art, poetry, and graffiti all tell the same story. People lusted, loved, and betrayed. They made mistakes. They boasted. They whispered. Even the gods were constantly having affairs. Jupiter alone could fill a scroll with his romantic misadventures. The gods modeled behavior that was chaotic, passionate, and very human. The walls of Pompeii provide a glimpse into everyday Roman passion. Scrawled messages like "I don't want to sell my body, but I need to eat," and "health to primogenia." My joy and delight speak of lust, survival, and affection, sometimes all at once. And that's the thing. These relationships, while often unequal or fleeting, weren't always cold. There were real emotions involved. Some men genuinely cared for their mistresses. Some freed them, gave them homes, continued to support them for life. Some women formed close bonds with their masters or clients. Others used the only power they had, their bodies, their wit, their charm, to secure a better future. But the shadow of inequality never disappeared. A relationship based on ownership could never be fully free. A romance built in a world of rigid class and gender expectations could only stretch so far. In rare moments, though, something more personal would shine through. A letter, a poem, an inscription on a ring. A token that said, in essence, "I see you. You matter to me." These fragments remind us that even in a society built on hierarchy and control, human connection still found a way. If you had walked quietly through a Roman villa at night, you might have heard the soft creak of a door, the rustle of footsteps, the quiet hush of a conversation not meant for anyone else. Secrets wrapped in silk sheets, promises whispered across class lines, love, or something like it, hidden where no one dared to look. By day, Rome was a city of rituals and respectability. The clatter of sandals echoed through marble courtyards, senators argued in the forum, and matrons kept their eyes down. But as always, where there are rules, there are those who break them. And in ancient Rome, few things stirred the city's gossip mill faster than a scandalous affair. Infidelity wasn't rare. It was just expected to be discreet, at least for men. A Roman man could have mistresses, concubines, or one-night flings without legal consequence, as long as his partners weren't the wives or daughters of other Roman citizens. As for women, the rules were stricter. A Roman wife was expected to be sexually exclusive to her husband. If she strayed, the consequences were swift and unforgiving. This imbalance was built into Roman law. Adultery was treated as a public offense when committed by a woman, not a private issue, not a marital disagreement, but a crime against the family and the state. Augustus, the first emperor, even passed a law called the Lex Julia de Adulteris, which made adultery a criminal act. Under this law, a woman caught cheating could be divorced, stripped of her dowry, and exiled to a barren island. Her lover, if caught, might face exile too, though usually with more sympathy and fewer long-term consequences. The husband, on the other hand, wasn't punished. In fact, he was required by law to report his adulterous wife. Failure to do so could make him guilty of pimping his own wife. It was a strange moral equation. Men were allowed to cheat, but had to show outrage when women did the same. Public figures were always under the microscope. Any hint of romantic scandal could damage a career. If a senator's wife was caught in an affair, it wasn't just personal embarrassment, it was political vulnerability. Rivals could use the scandal as leverage, and Rome loved a juicy story. Take Julia, the daughter of Augustus. Married off 3 times for political reasons, she eventually gained a reputation for having multiple affairs. Whether the rumors were exaggerated or not, her behavior clashed with her father's moral campaign. Augustus had her arrested and exiled, casting her out to a remote island and cutting her off from family and fortune. No one was above the rules, not even the emperor's daughter. Then there's the case of Empress Messalina, wife of Claudius. Roman historians painted her as the embodiment of excess, a woman who held secret marriages, organized wild parties, and even entered a public competition to see who could sleep with more men in a single night. Whether any of this was true or simply political slander is impossible to say, but the stories stuck, and Messalina met a grim end, executed after being declared a traitor. Even less extreme affairs carried risk. Lovers might send each other letters, sneak into private homes, or meet in crowded bathhouses. Discovery could mean ruin. The Roman poet Propertius, who loved to write about clandestine romances, described hiding in shadows and bribing servants to deliver notes. Love, in these stories, was a game of nerves. Sometimes the punishments weren't legal, they were social. A woman labeled as unfaithful might be abandoned by her family, disinvited from events, and ridiculed in graffiti. Public shaming was real. It could be delivered with a sharp tongue or a pointed inscription scratched onto a wall. Flora sleeps with anyone for a price. One cruel sentence could follow someone for life. That said, not every affair was about lust. Some were about power, ambition, or revenge. A noblewoman might take a lover to gain influence. A disgruntled wife might retaliate against her husband's infidelities. Affairs were tangled webs, part passion, part politics. The theatre world also played a role in romantic scandal. Actresses, dancers, and musicians were admired for their beauty and charm, but never considered respectable. A relationship with one of them was tolerated for a time, but always with a hint of danger. Fall in love with one, and people would talk. Try to marry one, and they would howl. And then there were the poets, who turned scandal into literature. Ovid's Amorous is a collection of poems dedicated to a fictional mistress named Corinna. Whether she was real or not, the poems read like a series of romantic misadventures, secret meetings, locked doors, jealous rivals. They're full of desire, humor, and the quiet panic of someone who knows he's in over his head. In fact, many Roman love poems read like cautionary tales disguised as flirtation. The lover sneaks in, barely escapes detection, then writes a poem about it and sends it into the world like a confession no one asked for. Not all of Rome's romantic scandals ended in disaster. Some were absorbed into public memory, gossiped about for a while, then forgotten. But they all left marks on reputations, families, and occasionally tombstones. A few even made it into law. Roman lawmakers constantly tried to regulate morality. They issued edicts, revised punishments, and lectured citizens on virtue. But the heart, as it turns out, doesn't always read legal texts. If you were walking through Rome in the early evening, you might pass someone glancing nervously over their shoulder, a woman slipping down an alley in a borrowed cloak, a man carrying 2 letters and a bottle of cheap perfume. The risk of shame, exile, or worse didn't always stop them. Sometimes it only added to the thrill. Scandal was part of the city's pulse. It buzzed through markets and taverns, floated between the marble columns of noble homes, and whispered through poetry and song. The public might have frowned, the laws might have thundered, but behind the scenes, secrets kept moving. Now we drift into another quiet corner of Roman life, one that rarely made its way into statues or state records. This is the realm of love that crossed lines, not just marital lines, but class lines. And in ancient Rome, crossing those boundaries could be far more scandalous than any affair between equals. Roman society was sharply divided. There were citizens and non-citizens, free people and slaves, patricians and plebeians, elites and the urban poor. These categories weren't just social labels, they defined nearly every part of life. Whom you could marry, where you could sit in a theatre, which courts would try your case, and, perhaps most importantly, what kind of love you were allowed to have. Marriage was tightly regulated by class. Patricians, the ancient aristocracy, were expected to marry within their own group. Equestrians, the wealthy business class, might marry into patrician families to climb socially. But anyone below that, they were considered unworthy of formal union. Love between classes was tolerated, occasionally even romanticized, but only when it didn't challenge social hierarchy. If a high-status man fell in love with a lower-class woman, he had options. He could take her as a mistress, a concubine, or even free her from slavery and live with her unofficially. But marrying her, that was rare and often seen as a foolish move. Such a union could damage a man's political career, create tensions within his family, and reduce the legitimacy of his children in the eyes of society. For women, the risk was even greater. A noble woman seen consorting with a man of low status, especially a slave or foreigner, faced disgrace or worse. Her body was considered tied to her family's honor. Any breach in that honor reflected on her father, her brothers, her husband. Her private choices had public consequences. There were legal restrictions, too. Under Roman law, citizens were not allowed to marry slaves. Even freedmen, former slaves who had been granted liberty, had limitations. A senator, for instance, could not legally marry a freedwoman. This wasn't just snobbery. It was an attempt to keep noble bloodlines pure. An idea that always tends to show up wherever power is inherited. But desire doesn't always care about the law. And the stories of forbidden love, while hard to verify, still surface now and then, in poems, in letters, and in the murky corners of historical rumor. Imagine a wealthy merchant's son in love with a tavern girl. He might visit her under cover of night, leave her gifts, promise her freedom. Maybe he means it, maybe he doesn't. She, in turn, might hope for more or know better. She might love him, or she might see him as a chance to escape poverty. The balance was never equal, but that didn't make the feelings any less real. In rare cases, love did bridge the gap. A freed woman might marry a freeborn man. A soldier stationed far from home might fall for a local woman and settle down in her village. These relationships were more likely in the provinces, where Roman rules were softer and identities more fluid. Still, they often existed in the shadow of suspicion. Class also shaped how love was expressed. A nobleman might write poetry. A craftsman might carve a heart into a wall. A slave might whisper in secret, knowing that even the whisper was dangerous. Their options were limited, but their emotions were not. One of the most moving examples we have comes from a tomb inscription for a former slave couple. The stone reads simply, "They lived together in faithfulness and love." No grand titles, no fancy lineage, just a life shared. In a world where love was often constrained by status, these small declarations shine brightly. Then there were the entertainers, actors, musicians, dancers. These people occupied an odd space. They could be famous, even wealthy, but they weren't respectable. A senator could enjoy their company, fund their careers, even father their children, but he could never marry them without scandal. Their profession made them perpetual outsiders in the eyes of the Roman elite. Even Roman women, with all their restrictions, weren't immune to crossing class lines. The stories that survive are often judgmental. A noblewoman runs off with a gladiator. A senator's wife is caught in a brothel. Are these tales true? Maybe, but they were told not to celebrate forbidden love, but to warn against it, to reinforce the boundaries, to remind everyone what happens when the social order is ignored. Because Rome was built on hierarchy. Every street, every statue, every ritual reinforced the idea that some people were meant to rule and others to serve. Love that challenged that idea, love that ignored it, was dangerous. Still, it happened. Quietly, behind curtains, beneath balconies, in the long shadows between alleyways, to people from different worlds, meeting when no one was watching. They might share a meal, a moment, a promise. They might know it can't last, but they choose it anyway. The stories of these lovers rarely made it into history books. Their names were often lost, but here and there a line of poetry survives. A scratched message in a doorway. A pair of burial urns placed side by side. Small signs that even in the most rigid of societies, love found its way into the cracks. Now, let's shift into something softer, or at least more entertaining. Because for all their strict rules and social rigidity, the Romans weren't humorless about love. In fact, they were unusually good at laughing about it, writing about it, and immortalizing its absurdities in poetry that still survives today. The Roman poets, especially those writing in the late Republic and early Empire, seemed to understand that love was rarely tidy. It was messy, irrational, inconvenient, and often unwise. And yet they kept returning to it, not with rose-colored glasses, but with winks, complaints, and raised eyebrows. Take Catullus, for instance. His poems are some of the most personal to come out of antiquity. He wasn't writing about epic heroes or noble ideals. He was writing about Lesbia, not her real name. That was likely Clodia, a married woman from a powerful family. But Lesbia, as he calls her, is the focus of his most famous verses. At first, his tone is adoring. He writes of kisses, of whispered meetings, of insatiable desire. He counts the kisses, hundreds, thousands, beyond reason. But soon, the tone changes. The poems turn bitter. He accuses her of betrayal, mocks her lovers, curses her name. The relationship sours, and the poetry follows. What's remarkable is how familiar it all feels. Jealousy, hope, heartbreak, petty revenge. These things haven't changed in 2,000 years. Catullus swears he's done with her, and then a few lines later admits he still can't stay away. It's not heroic, it's just human. Then there's Ovid, who brings a different energy entirely. Ovid is clever, theatrical, and very aware of his audience. His amoras and ars amatoria read like a mix of stand-up comedy and dating advice. He gives detailed instructions on how to pick up women at the races. He suggests pretending to be injured so you can sit beside her. He advises men to learn her interests, flatter her tastes, and write poems. Even if you're bad at it, it's all delivered with a smirk. Ovid knows he's being cheeky. He even admits it. He's not trying to elevate love. He's trying to survive it, enjoy it, and maybe outwit it. He tells men not to cry too much, not to be too available, and always to compliment her eyebrows. Of course, not everyone appreciated his sense of humor. As we touched on earlier, Augustus eventually exiled him. The official reason was a poem and a mistake, which remains one of history's more cryptic justifications. The poem was probably the ars amatoria, the mistake, possibly something far more personal involving the imperial family. Either way, Ovid's wit had gone too far. Other poets took different approaches. Tibullus wrote about love in more melancholic tones, often longing for simple rural life with his beloved. Propertius, meanwhile, seemed forever entangled in complicated affairs with a woman named Cynthia, or at least a literary version of her. His poetry is full of late-night arguments, dramatic departures, and emotional whiplash. What's striking across all of them is the range. Roman love poetry wasn't just a genre, it was a mirror. It captured lust, obsession, resentment, hope, and everything in between. It was rarely about marriage. It almost never ended happily. But it was honest, at least in its own performative way. And it wasn't just the elite who engaged in romantic expression. Walk through the ruins of Pompeii, and you'll find love and lust etched into the walls. Some inscriptions are crude, some poetic, some strangely touching. Marcellus loves Praeneste. May the gods approve. I have been with many women, but none like her. Success to lovers, and may their passion never fade. There's a kind of rawness in these messages. No editors, no scrolls, just the impulse to record a feeling before it faded. Sometimes it's hopeful, sometimes it's vulgar, often it's funny. The Romans weren't romantic in the modern sense. They didn't idealize soulmates or fairy tale endings, but they did understand the chaos of attraction. They knew how it could undo reason, provoke laughter, or bring a man to his knees. They also saw love as a kind of performance, a social dance, something to be played with, narrated, and occasionally mocked. There was no shame in writing a poem about a failed affair. In fact, it was encouraged. If you could turn heartbreak into verse, you hadn't really lost. You might picture a Roman poet by candlelight, sitting in a cluttered study, muttering rhymes and scratching words into a wax tablet. He pauses, smiles at a particularly sharp line, then sighs, not because he's heartbroken, but because he knows this one will sting when she reads it. And women wrote too, though their voices have largely been lost. A few fragments survive, verses of longing, gratitude, or sharp humor. But most of the surviving record comes from men. Whether women were discouraged from writing or simply not preserved, we'll never know for sure. But we can imagine them, responding in kind, in private letters or whispered performances to trusted friends. So what was love in ancient Rome? It was theatrical, risky, and often one-sided. It was expressed in poems passed under doors and carved into walls. It was loud in taverns and quiet in bedrooms. It made fools of men and legends of poets. It wasn't about happy endings. It was about the spectacle, the sensation, the moment. And when that moment passed, the poetry remained, inked into history, smirking across time. Until now, much of our walk has taken us through the marble halls and well-oiled courtyards of Rome's upper class, the senators, poets, and noble women who filled scrolls and scandal sheets alike. But now we step onto a quieter street, past the flickering signs of a bakery and the chisel marks of a stonecutter's shop, because most Romans weren't aristocrats. They were bakers, soldiers, merchants, freedmen, and day laborers. And their experience of love and partnership was something entirely different. There were no dowries exchanged in grand family meetings. No laws were written about their liaisons. But love still found its way into their lives, practical, imperfect, and sometimes surprisingly sweet. Let's start with how relationships were formed. Among the working classes, marriages were often informal. Two people might simply begin living together and call themselves married. If they stayed together long enough, typically a year, Roman custom might recognize the union through usius, the habit of cohabitation. There wasn't always a formal ceremony, and there certainly wasn't a legal contract if they didn't have much property to protect. That didn't mean these relationships were flimsy. On the contrary, many seem to have been stable and affectionate. Tomb inscriptions and epitaphs from ordinary Romans are some of the most touching records we have of personal love. A man might refer to his wife as his heart or his lifelong joy. A woman might praise her husband as a good and faithful partner, not a senator, but a man who worked with his hands and came home each night. You can almost picture them, he, dust-covered from the workshop, she, preparing lentils over a small stove, both tired, both aging, but still sharing the same mat and roof. It wasn't poetic, but it was real. Dating, in the modern sense, didn't really exist. There were no formal courtships involving dinner, conversation, and flowers. Time and money were limited. Most people married young and quickly. A man might notice a neighbor's daughter fetching water. A girl might spot a bread vendor who always gave her an extra slice. The spark might be small, but it was enough. Romantic gestures were simple. A shared loaf of bread, a new scarf, a sweet fruit, and if a man composed a poem or scratched a message on a wall, it wasn't to impress a crowd. It was for one person. It might have been crude. It might have been misspelled, but it meant something. Of course, not all unions were based on affection. Economic necessity played a major role. A woman might choose a husband who could offer stability, even if he was dull or distant. A man might marry the daughter of a friend to secure work or housing. Survival came first. Love was a luxury, but one that sometimes came along anyway. Freedmen and freedwomen, former slaves who had earned or been granted their freedom, had their own unique challenges. They could marry legally, but social stigma lingered. A freeborn citizen might hesitate to marry someone with a slave past, even if they were hard-working and respectable. As a result, freed people often formed partnerships within their own communities. Many rose to success through trade or craftsmanship, and their tombs proudly display their names, occupations, and loved ones side by side. There's something quietly powerful about those inscriptions. Not the grand declarations of senators, but simple affirmations. To my wife, whom I loved dearly, and who loved me. No mention of politics or lineage. Just two people who shared a life. Children were a natural part of most of these relationships, and while infant mortality was high, families still formed. Parents named their children after themselves or the gods they worshipped. They told stories. They worked together. They grew old, often in the same tiny homes they started in. And yet, even in these humble settings, love could be complicated. Jealousy, infidelity, and betrayal weren't exclusive to the upper class. A wife might suspect her husband of visiting brothels. A man might grumble about his wife's sharp tongue. Domestic arguments played out in every neighborhood. Some were resolved quietly. Others ended in separation. Divorce, even among the poor, wasn't unheard of. Prostitution was common and legal in Rome. Many men, especially those without the means or interest to marry, visited brothels. These establishments ranged from seedy alley stalls to more organized houses of pleasure. Women working in these places were often enslaved or desperate. Their customers didn't see them as romantic partners, but their presence shaped the city's landscape of desire. There were also taverns, where alcohol loosened tongues and rules. While respectable women rarely entered such spaces, others did. Some served drinks and found companionship after hours. The lines between flirtation, commerce, and survival were often blurry. Still, relationships formed. A poor man and a tavern girl might decide to share a room and call it love. A laundress and a carpenter might save enough money to buy a modest home and raise children. These weren't fairy tales. They were partnerships built not on fantasy, but on shared burdens. And when death came, as it often did too soon, the surviving partner might spend what little money they had on a simple stone, just a name, a few kind words, and a hope that the gods would be gentle. So while the history books focus on emperors and empresses, on scandal and seduction, it's these everyday stories that tell us the most about Roman love. Not dramatic, not poetic, but grounded in daily bread, scraped knees, and quiet evenings after work. And maybe that's what makes them the most real of all. Now, let's slow our steps and take a look at the architecture of Roman love. Not the physical buildings, but the invisible structure built from rules, expectations, and social codes. If you want to understand why love worked the way it did in ancient Rome, you need to understand gender. From birth, Roman boys and girls were raised to play different roles. Boys were taught to speak up, take charge, lead households, and command respect. Girls were taught to obey, remain modest, marry young, and manage homes. These weren't just cultural suggestions. They were deeply rooted expectations backed by law, religion, and social pressure. By adulthood, the gap between male and female freedom was wide. A Roman man, particularly one of means, had choices. He could sleep with mistresses, frequent brothels, or keep a concubine. As long as his partners weren't married Roman women, no one cared much. The law didn't punish him. Society didn't shun him. In fact, his behavior might be met with a knowing nod and a shrug. His wife, however, lived under a different standard. She was expected to be chaste before marriage and faithful after. Any affair, real or rumored, could ruin her life. She might be cast out by her husband, lose her dowry, or face exile. Her name would be whispered through the streets with far more venom than his ever would. Even within marriage, the power imbalance was baked in. The husband controlled the family's public identity, legal decisions, and finances. The wife might manage the household, a large responsibility, but she had no voice in politics or law. Her honor depended entirely on how well she conformed to the image of the perfect Roman matron. That image was severe, modest, quiet, devoted to family, loyal to her husband whether he deserved it or not. Her clothing reinforced this. A Roman matron's stola was long and covered the body, her hair pinned up, her jewelry restrained. It wasn't about fashion. It was about sending a message. I am respectable. I am safe from scandal. If a woman strayed from that image, if she laughed too loudly in public, wore her hair too loosely, or walked unaccompanied, people noticed, and they judged. A woman's reputation in Rome was more fragile than glass. Once cracked, it was nearly impossible to restore. This wasn't limited to upper-class women. Across all levels of Roman society, women were expected to stay within clearly drawn lines. A freedwoman who earned her living through trade might still be criticized for speaking too freely or dressing too boldly. A slave woman had even less protection. Her body wasn't her own to guard. And yet, women were resourceful. Some worked around the rules. Some used them to their advantage. A clever woman might present herself as the ideal matron in public, while managing her own affairs behind closed doors. Others formed alliances, built networks, and quietly influenced the men around them. There were women who became business owners, priestesses, even philosophers. They existed, but they were exceptions, not expectations. And they had to walk carefully, knowing how quickly admiration could turn to condemnation. In the world of love, these double standards played out constantly. A man could write poetry about his many lovers and be praised for his wit. A woman who did the same would be accused of shamelessness. A man could joke about his exploits in the bathhouse. A woman who laughed at the same joke might be seen as inappropriate. Even grief followed gendered lines. A widower who mourned his wife for years was considered noble. A widow who did the same might be pitied, but also pressured to remarry and resume her duties. Her feelings were valid only if they didn't get in the way of her usefulness. The law reflected all of this. As mentioned earlier, adultery was a criminal offense for women, but not for men. Fathers could legally kill daughters caught in the act of adultery under certain circumstances. Husbands had fewer rights in that regard, but were still encouraged to report unfaithful wives. The state saw a woman's sexual behavior not as personal, but as public concern. Of course, there were some limits. A man couldn't just do whatever he pleased. If he openly pursued another man's wife, he might face retaliation. If he disgraced himself too publicly, it could damage his reputation. But these consequences were more about politics than morality. One of the clearest illustrations of Roman double standards comes from funeral epitaphs. When men died, their stones praised bravery, public service, or military glory. When women died, the praise focused on virtue, loyalty, and modesty. She stayed at home. She kept the house. She was faithful to her husband. These were the highest compliments a woman could receive. That isn't to say women never found affection or equality in their relationships. Some couples truly cared for each other. Some husbands respected their wives deeply. But even in those cases, the system remained tilted. A woman could be loved and still have no legal power. She could be valued, but not heard. And so, Roman love existed within this rigid framework. Men moved freely, wrote the poems, chased desire. Women moved carefully, guarded their reputations, and bore the consequences of transgression. Yet even within those limits, women found ways to express themselves, through quiet acts of resistance, through managing their homes with precision, through the names they whispered in prayer, the gifts they left at shrines, and the tokens they saved in secret boxes. If you had passed a Roman couple on the street, him in a worn toga, her in a modest stola, you might not see the imbalance. But it was there, just beneath the surface. shaping every glance and silence. And while some things have changed in the centuries since, others feel eerily familiar. Now we move into the legal heart of Roman relationships, a world of contracts, property, and quiet exits. Because while marriage in ancient Rome was full of ceremony and expectation, it was never as permanent as it appeared. Roman love might begin in legal formality, but it could end with a simple sentence. Unlike many ancient cultures, Rome made divorce relatively easy, at least for men. There were no courts to plead before, no public trials, no long negotiations. All a man had to do was state his intent. In some cases, he simply sent his wife back to her father's house. That was it. The marriage was over. No signature, no hearing. Just a message, often delivered by a slave, saying, essentially, "You are no longer my wife." A woman could also initiate divorce, especially in later periods, but it was more difficult. She needed to have her own financial backing, the support of her family, and a compelling reason. In practice, most divorces were male-driven, especially among the elite. Why would a man divorce his wife? The reasons varied. Infidelity was one, though more symbolic than sincere in many cases. A woman accused of adultery could face legal consequences, especially after Augustus passed his morality laws. But often, the reasons were mundane: failure to produce children, political inconvenience, family pressure, or simply falling out of favor. In some circles, divorce became almost routine. Cicero divorced his wife Terentia after many years and then quickly married a much younger woman who happened to be wealthy. Political families treated marriage like property: trade it, upgrade it, discard it when necessary. Still, divorce wasn't always cruel. Sometimes it was practical. Sometimes it was mutual. A couple might part quietly, with no scandal, just a shared understanding that the arrangement no longer worked. Among ordinary Romans, this kind of quiet separation was likely common, especially in marriages without much wealth or reputation at stake. But whenever divorce happened, it brought up one very important issue: the dowry. The dowry wasn't just a gift. It was a financial contribution from the bride's family to help support the new household. It might include money, land, jewelry, even slaves. In upper-class marriages, dowries could be massive, and their return was a serious matter. If a man divorced his wife without good cause, he was generally expected to return the dowry. If she was at fault, say, accused of adultery, he might keep part or all of it. The exact terms varied, but the dowry was always central. In some ways, it was the spine of the marriage agreement. This meant that even in affairs of the heart, money was never far away. Families negotiated dowries with care. Wives, especially those in uncertain marriages, kept track of their dowry rights. A man considering divorce would have to weigh whether he was willing to give back that land, or those silver cups, or that tidy pile of denarii. For women, the dowry was a form of protection. Not perfect, but important. A divorced woman with a returned dowry could start over. She might remarry or live independently. Without it, she might be stranded, especially if she had no children to support her or no family to fall back on. That leads us to another Roman legal structure: manus, the authority a husband had over his wife. In the early Republic, manus gave the husband legal control. The wife became part of his family and was subject to his power, just like a daughter. But over time, especially by the late Republic, many marriages were made sin manu, without the transfer of authority. In these cases, a woman remained legally tied to her birth family, even while living with her husband. This gave her more autonomy. She could keep her property, she could divorce more easily, and she could manage her affairs without a man's approval. It was, in some ways, a quiet revolution. Roman women still couldn't vote or hold office, but some gained legal tools to protect themselves. A well-positioned woman, especially a widow or one from a wealthy family, could become surprisingly powerful, managing estates, arranging marriages, even funding public projects. Widowhood, in fact, was one of the few ways a Roman woman could gain real independence. A widowed woman who chose not to remarry could control her dowry, her property, and her household. She still faced social expectations, but she was no longer under anyone's legal thumb. Of course, not all marriages were so complicated. Among the lower classes, there were no dowries, no contracts, no questions of manus. Just two people sharing a home. If they separated, there were no lawyers involved. No coins exchanged hands. Just a change of bedding and perhaps a few neighbors whispering behind their hands. But even in the simplest unions, legal love left its mark. Children born within marriage were considered legitimate. That meant they could inherit property, carry on the family name, and participate in religious rites. Children born outside of marriage had fewer rights. So even when the marriage itself was informal, its recognition mattered. Roman law was always practical. It didn't require love. It didn't care about feelings. It cared about order, about property, inheritance, and social stability. If affection existed, that was a bonus. If it didn't, the legal system rolled on anyway. Still, in the margins of those dry legal texts, you can see glimpses of something more human. A man petitioning for his wife's dowry because he misses her. A woman refusing to remarry because she still wears her first husband's ring. A couple who divorced and later remarried, choosing each other a second time. Rome, for all its sternness, couldn't fully contain the unpredictability of the heart. And sometimes, behind all the wax tablets and scrolls, two people simply looked at each other, shrugged, and said, "Let's try again." As we wander further into the world of Roman love, we find ourselves drawn not just into the arms of people, but into the hands of the gods. Because in Rome, desire didn't exist in a vacuum. It lived in temples, whispered through rituals, and sat etched into votive offerings, placed carefully at the feet of divine statues. The gods were everywhere in Roman life, and love was no exception. Whether you were hoping to attract a spouse, win back an unfaithful partner, or simply avoid humiliation at the hands of desire, you would do well to keep the gods on your side. Venus, of course, reigned supreme over the realm of love. She was the Roman counterpart to the Greek Aphrodite, goddess of beauty, sensuality, and irresistible charm. Her temples weren't just places of worship, they were destinations for those seeking favor in the matters of the heart. Offerings to Venus included perfumes, flowers, small statues, and handwritten prayers. Some people swore she had the power to soften the hardest hearts, to make someone fall in love with you, or at least glance your way at the marketplace. Then there was Juno, particularly Juno Lucina, the protector of marriage and childbirth. She represented the more serious side of romantic partnership. Not flirtation or passion, but union, legacy, and domestic life. Brides prayed to her for fertility, harmony, and a smooth transition into married life. Mothers prayed to her for healthy births and strong sons. Even lesser-known deities had roles to play. Cupid, the mischievous god of desire, was always nearby. In art, he's often shown with a bow and arrow, ready to strike unsuspecting hearts. In literature, He represents the unpredictable nature of attraction. One moment you're thinking clearly, and the next, you've done something utterly foolish in the name of love. The ancients knew this feeling well. Other divine figures served more specific functions. Some governed lust, others fidelity. Priapus, for example, was a rural fertility god, often depicted in exaggerated form, a guardian of gardens, and, in a strange twist, of sexual potency. His statues were often placed at property boundaries or gardens to ward off thieves, but his symbolism extended into bedroom matters too. Prayers to Priapus were less romantic than practical, if you catch the implication. It wasn't all about worship, though. Romans were also deeply superstitious, and love was an area especially rich with omens, spells, and charms. Love spells were common, often performed by women, especially those on the losing end of a romantic triangle. These spells could be simple, like writing someone's name on a piece of lead and burying it, or elaborate rituals involving hair, wax dolls, and whispered incantations under the moonlight. Sometimes they were designed to inspire love. Other times, they aimed to break apart rival lovers or punish those who had betrayed affection. We know this not from fantasy, but from archaeology. Cursed tablets have been found buried near temples, inscribed with carefully worded messages. Some ask the gods to bring a lover back. Others ask for a rival's beauty to fade. The handwriting is often shaky, hurried. The desperation behind the words is very human. One such tablet reads, "Bind the mind, the hands, and the thoughts of Plotius until he returns to me." Another curses a woman by name, blaming her for stealing a beloved. These weren't elite poets writing dramatic verse. These were ordinary people turning to the divine when logic and charm failed. Temples sometimes doubled as social spaces too. Young men and women might gather at religious festivals, where games, songs, and shared meals offered a rare chance to mingle. Lupercalia, held in mid-February, was one such festival, a celebration of fertility that included rituals, matchmaking games, and quite a bit of teasing. In some ways, it was a distant ancestor to Valentine's Day, though with a lot more goatskins and ritual running involved. Some Romans claimed dreams could be divine messages about love. A vivid dream of someone you desired was taken as a sign, either a warning or an encouragement. Dream interpretation guides existed, full of cryptic symbols. If you dreamed of losing your shoes, it might mean you'd lose your lover. If you dreamed of honey, passion was on the way. And then there were the omens, a sudden gust of wind, the way a bird flew overhead, the shape of spilled wine on the table. All these could be interpreted as signs from the gods. You might wait for a favorable omen before proposing marriage or accepting a lover's gift. A bad omen could ruin a date before it even began. Despite all this divine attention, the gods were not especially consistent. Venus could be generous one day and indifferent the next. Cupid's arrows struck without warning. The gods weren't moral judges, they were forces. Unpredictable, powerful, and often amused by human efforts to control what was never meant to be tame. Still, the rituals continued. People lit candles, left offerings, whispered prayers, not because they expected miracles, necessarily, but because it felt better to try, better to toss a coin into the fountain than sit in silence. Better to leave a flower at Venus's altar than admit you were powerless. It's easy to imagine a young woman standing outside a temple at dusk, holding a small garland of herbs. She's unsure whether the boy from the bakery feels the same. She's too shy to ask. So she offers her garland to Venus and hopes for a sign. Or perhaps a middle-aged man leaves a coin at Cupid's statue, hoping to win back his estranged wife. These moments were quiet, private, and deeply human. In Rome, love was never just about the people involved. It was a negotiation with the divine. A careful dance with forces that couldn't be seen but were always felt. And whether you believed or not, it never hurt to have Venus on your side. Let's step off the main road for a moment, away from the carefully defined Roman ideals of husband and wife, and into the quieter spaces where same-sex desire and relationships existed. Sometimes in plain sight, sometimes behind closed doors. Because while ancient Rome had rigid social roles, it also had a far more fluid approach to sexuality than many later societies. Modern labels, like gay or straight, didn't exist in the Roman world. Instead, Roman attitudes focused less on the gender of one's partner and more on status, power, and social roles. In short, what mattered most was who was perceived to be in control. For Roman men, engaging in same-sex acts was acceptable under certain conditions. The key factor: he had to be the one taking the dominant or active role. So long as he maintained his masculinity, his citizen status, and his control in the encounter, no one cared much. If anything, it was seen as a normal part of male behavior. The passive role, on the other hand, especially if taken by an adult Roman male citizen, was ridiculed. To willingly submit was seen as shameful. Roman society prized dominance and control, and being sexually passive was equated with being weak or unmanly. It wasn't about love or orientation. It was about hierarchy. This attitude was so embedded in the culture that insults often focused on a man's presumed sexual passivity. Roman satire was ruthless. Poets like Martial and Juvenal made brutal jokes at the expense of men who were said to enjoy being dominated, especially if they were rich, powerful, or pretentious. The humor was sharp, not necessarily because the acts were seen as immoral, but because they inverted social expectations. Relationships between adult male citizens and younger boys, especially adolescents, were also present, though Roman society had a more complicated view of them than the Greeks. While pederasty was idealized in classical Athens, Romans were far more ambivalent. Relationships with boys, especially if they were slaves or non-citizens, did occur and were often tolerated, but they came with caveats. Roman law eventually placed limits on these relationships, particularly to protect freeborn boys from being exploited. The lex scantinia, a vague and rarely enforced law, was sometimes cited as a way to prosecute adult men who were believed to corrupt youth. Still, in practice, enforcement was selective and politically motivated. As for emotional same-sex relationships, they did happen, though it's difficult to determine how they were viewed. Most of the surviving sources were written by elite men, and they rarely describe same-sex love as romantic or equal. Often, it's framed as indulgence, amusement, or lust. But once in a while, something more personal slips through. The Emperor Hadrian is perhaps the most famous example. His relationship with Antinous, a beautiful young Greek man, was not just physical, it was deeply emotional. When Antinous died under mysterious circumstances while traveling with Hadrian in Egypt, the emperor was devastated. He had statues of Antinous erected across the empire, founded a city in his name, and even elevated him to divine status. This wasn't a casual fling. It was grief, memory, and love, all carved into stone. Hadrian wasn't alone. Other emperors, including Nero and Elagabalus, had male lovers and even held mock weddings with them. Roman historians, predictably, treated these acts with ridicule and horror. but often for political reasons. Any deviation from Stoic Roman masculinity was seen as weakness in a leader. Women, meanwhile, are much harder to trace. There are very few clear records of female same-sex relationships. In Rome, the male authors of the time either ignored the topic or treated it as a punchline. Some poems and writings mention women who love women, but almost always in mocking or voyeuristic tones. One of the few exceptions is Martial, who refers sarcastically to women marrying each other, not as a serious social concern, but as a target of his usual crude humor. It's possible that such relationships existed more freely in private life, without access to public power. Women may have found space for intimacy in personal friendships, shared households, or religious communities. But since these relationships didn't threaten the patriarchal structure directly, they were rarely documented. Outside of Rome, in the provinces, and among other cultures within the empire, same-sex relationships might have followed different rules. The Roman Empire absorbed dozens of cultures with their own traditions and taboos. What was scandalous in Rome might have been tolerated or even celebrated elsewhere. Religious cults also offered a kind of escape. Some mystery religions, like the cult of Cybele, attracted followers who rejected traditional gender roles altogether. Men known as Galli served as priests in female clothing, often undergoing ritual castration and living outside the norms of Roman masculinity. These individuals were respected within their religious roles, even as they were mocked in broader Roman society. It's worth noting that same-sex relationships were not framed in terms of identity. There was no concept of someone being a certain orientation. A man might sleep with men and women throughout his life without it defining who he was. What mattered was behavior, not identity, and how that behavior fit into Rome's broader obsession with status and control. So what did love look like between two men or two women in ancient Rome? It's hard to say with certainty. Some of it was exploitative. Some of it was affectionate. Some was quiet, unrecorded, and entirely lost to history. But just like today, there must have been moments, quiet, flickering ones, when someone reached for a hand, stayed longer than expected, or left a carved message behind. Now we return to where we started, the grand, crumbling image of ancient Roman love, as imagined by films, novels, and late-night documentaries. The flowing togas, the candlelit feasts, the passionate glances between patricians across crowded banquets. It's a tempting picture, but one that drifts far from what the evidence actually tells us. In truth, Roman romance was rarely romantic. Start with the most popular myth that Roman love was all passion and poetry. In reality, marriage was first and foremost an alliance. For the elite, it was a transaction. The bride was chosen for her lineage, her dowry, and the usefulness of her family's political connections. Emotions came later, if at all. It's true that poets wrote about love with dramatic flair, but they were the exception. And even they often treated love as a game or a battlefield rather than something gentle and mutual. Another myth, that Roman men freely married whomever they pleased, regardless of class. This couldn't be further from the truth. The marriage market was heavily stratified. Social boundaries were rarely crossed, and when they were, the backlash could be severe. Marrying beneath one's station, especially for senators and equestrians, could be political suicide. Even emperors had to navigate these waters carefully. We also like to imagine Roman relationships as glamorous, as though everyone was either a brooding hero or a seductive empress. But the majority of Romans were neither. They were ordinary people trying to live and work and find companionship in crowded apartments, shared tenements, and noisy streets. Their unions weren't built on stolen kisses. They were built on shared chores, economic need, and often a quiet kind of loyalty that doesn't make it into epic scripts. Then there's the idea that Roman women were all cloistered and passive, locked away from desire. While it's true they had limited rights and faced intense restrictions, many found ways to express affection, exert influence, and build meaningful lives. Some owned businesses, some managed large households, some even outlived multiple husbands and maintained control of their own estates. Their love lives may have been constrained, but they were never invisible. Popular culture also tends to ignore just how transactional intimacy could be. Relationships with slaves, concubines, and prostitutes were common, and often treated as normal parts of male life. Modern portrayals frequently romanticize these dynamics, glossing over the vast inequality that defined them. Real love did emerge in some of these relationships, but the imbalance of power was always there, quiet but unignorable. And let's not forget the persistent fantasy of the grand Roman wedding. Modern depictions often show sweeping ceremonies with flowers, music, and tearful vows. In truth, many Roman weddings were short, practical, and lacking in fanfare. Among the lower classes, they might have been nothing more than two people moving in together and telling their neighbors. There were no rings, no vows, and certainly no elaborate white dresses. It's also easy to imagine that Rome was indifferent to romance, that emotions were suppressed under layers of stoicism and law. But while public life discouraged open affection, the private world told a different story. Letters, graffiti, tomb inscriptions, all reveal people who missed each other, longed for each other, and remembered each other. They wrote things like "She was the light of my life," or "He loved me more than I deserved." These simple phrases ring with real emotion. Even the Romans themselves sometimes mocked their own hypocrisy. Poets joked about loveless marriages and hopeless crushes. Satirists mocked rich men who fell for actresses and women who wrote too many love letters. There was always a tension between public virtue and private feeling, a tension that remains all too familiar today. Modern storytellers also tend to imagine Roman same-sex relationships as taboo or scandalous, but as we've seen, the truth was more nuanced. The issue wasn't gender so much as social role. Dominance, status, and public image mattered far more than orientation. Relationships between men existed openly, within limits. And while records of same-sex love between women are harder to find, that doesn't mean they didn't exist, just that they weren't preserved. Perhaps the biggest myth of all is that love in Rome was either pure or depraved, that it had to be one or the other. In reality, it was a mix of duty and feeling, ambition and comfort, quiet affection and spectacular collapse. It was awkward. It was sometimes beautiful. It was often disappointing. Which is to say, it was human. If you strip away the armor, the scrolls, the marble busts, and mosaic floors, you're left with people trying to connect with each other. A man writing to a lover who never writes back. A woman standing at a temple, asking for a sign. A couple who share a meal, then fall asleep on opposite sides of a too-small bed. None of it is made for the stage. None of it belongs in an opera. But all of it is true. Rome, at its height, was an empire of extraordinary buildings and brutal politics, but its heart was filled with the same quiet hopes you might find anywhere. Hopes that someone would choose you, that someone would stay, that someone would remember you when you were gone. And now, as our journey through ancient Roman love draws to a close, allow your thoughts to settle. The streets of Rome grow quieter. The echoes of footsteps fade into the distance. The flickering torches have burned low, and the marketplace has gone still. You are no longer surrounded by the clamor of senators, the rustle of stolers, or the soft whisper of scribes dipping their pens in ink. The city rests now, blanketed in the hush of midnight, where only the breeze moves, carrying with it a trace of olive oil, old stone, and faint perfume. Picture the outlines of crumbling villas under the stars, roof tiles worn smooth by centuries of sun and rain, a fountain still trickling in the center of an abandoned courtyard. Somewhere, a half-burned candle glows faintly in a windowsill, its flame swaying in rhythm with the night. In that silence, behind those walls, our lives will never fully know. People who hoped and feared and fell in love, not so differently from anyone else. They made promises. They broke them. They laughed in bed and wept behind closed doors. Their hearts were just as loud, even if history only captured their whispers. Let yourself breathe slowly now. Let the images dim. The scrolls are rolled up, the togas folded, the stone steps cooled by the night air. You've walked through the villas and alleys, past temples and taverns, and now it's time to step away from it all. Not into history, but into sleep. Close your eyes, rest your mind, drift softly into dreams, where time stretches gently and every sound becomes a murmur. Sleep well and good night.